Welcome. I'm Hajo Eicken, Director of the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and one of the co-organizers of the Arctic Observing Summit 2020. I wanted to take this opportunity and give you a bit more background on the type of work that will be happening in the AOS working groups. If you're watching this presentation, you've already dug into the details of the agenda. You've navigated the online AOS website. And I wanted to just spend a few more minutes now to review in further detail what you can expect out of the work in the working groups, with the hopes, of course, that you'll be interested in joining one or several of the working groups during the course of the summit and then afterwards. So just as a reminder, what is the Arctic Observing Summit? It's a gathering that is meant to exchange ideas and develop ways in which we can broadly improve the way we conduct and coordinate Arctic observing through collaboration and sharing of resources. We expect that the products, so the work that is being conducted in the working groups for this summit, and some of the outcomes of the summit as a whole will include these 4 items that you see here. One is we're hoping to lay the foundation for a roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems, the so-called ROADS effort. That's part of the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks initiative. That's a broad, cross-cutting initiative, and it's this Arctic Observing Summit that's helping us launch this effort on a broader scale. As part of that, of course, we're also hoping that through the various interactions, the review of materials or contributions that people have made to the Arctic Observing Summit, that we'll end up with improved coordination of sustained Arctic observations. Third, we're hoping to, as part of this work in particular, address critical observing needs and observing coordination needs for the theme of food security and indigenous needs. There is a separate working group number 3, set up for this purpose, and that is an important aspect of this summit, to explore in more depth a particular thematic area with a focus on food security. And finally, the deliberations of the summit, including the summit statement and recommendations and some of the other material generated in the working groups, is going to be important input to the 3rd Arctic Science Ministerial meeting. That meeting will be co-hosted by Iceland and Japan. It will take place in Tokyo, Japan in November this year. And it's a gathering of more than 30 science ministers and other leading science policy makers from more than 30 different nations, focused on specific questions of pressing urgency in terms of science collaboration in the Arctic. So how are we going to achieve these goals? These 5 points here give you a brief summary of that. First of all, we have our 5 AOS working groups, and they're going to be the hubs within which people with different backgrounds, different expertise, are focusing on jointly working on specific questions or issues and generating output. Then these working group activities are going to lay the groundwork for the roadmap for Arctic Observing and Data System, or ROADS. And we anticipate that the collaborations in these working groups will continue beyond the actual AOS, the summit itself, but continue over the course of the next couple of years towards the summit AOS in 2022, largely under the umbrella of the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks initiative. Third, as part of the summit, the working groups will explore key examples of how so-called essential Arctic variables, or EAVs, lead to shared societal benefits and help us determine observing requirements. So that's an important aspect of some of the more detailed, in-depth work in the 5 working groups. Fourth, we have a series of community white papers that you can access through the website that provide further input into the process and may be of interest for you to review. I'll briefly give you a bit more of an update on those here in a few minutes. And finally, of course, we have plenary presentations and panel discussions, both pre-recorded and live, that are going to highlight key aspects of Arctic observing. So that's the Arctic Observing Summit in a broad sweep. So today, what I want to do as part of this presentation is, first of all, briefly recap how the Arctic Observing Summit is going to lay this foundation for a roadmap for Arctic observing. I then will briefly cover the essential Arctic variable concept and how those help us link societal benefits to specific observing requirements. We'll briefly review the key resources that you as summit participants have in the form of the website and in terms of the different AOS working groups. I'll show you parts of the website that you might want to visit on your own. We'll also briefly review how you can learn more about what specifically is going on inside the individual working groups that you might want to join and what their specific tasks and charge are going to be. And then we'll close off with some final remarks. With this presentation, I'd also like to point out that while you're able to review this on your own time, on the 30th of March, as part of the welcoming session, or several members of the AOS working, AOS Executive Committee will be available to answer any questions you might have as well on this. So how do we integrate sustained observations of Arctic change? How do we coordinate a range of different activities that are underway, either in individual countries or supported through larger scale pan-Arctic or global programs? You see a few examples here. Global Cryosphere Watch is something that some of you may be familiar with. The European Union supported Antares project. You have the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks initiative that's part of the International Arctic Science Committee and the Arctic Council, or the Svalbard Integrated Observing System, SIOS. There's a range of these, and I'm sure that each one of you that's involved in Arctic observing can probably think of several dozen of these that you're aware of. All of these observing efforts have been carefully thought out and are focused on a specific set of questions. The grand challenge that we face in the Arctic is, how do we add value and ensure overarching value of these different types of observing activities by making sure that individual observations are intercomparable and interoperable between different programs, by ensuring that the same thing is true for the data, that the data information products are accessible across the board, and also that the types of observations, the locations, the frequency with which they're gathered, all directly meet the requirements and information needs of those who are actually relying and depending on observations coming out of different observing networks and observing systems. That's the big challenge, and you can already see, the larger scope here. Essentially, what we're trying to do is nudge all of these different efforts in a way such that both through bottom-up and top-down activities, we achieve a greater alignment and greater coordination and greater interoperability between these different types of efforts. Well, how do you achieve that? The first thing that has already been accomplished and is still underway in some areas are assessments of existing observing capacity. I'd like to point to the SAON, again, that's the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks initiative. The SAON Committee on Observations and Networks has conducted such inventories, but there's other efforts underway. For example, as part of the last Arctic Science Ministerial that was hosted in Berlin in 2018, quite a bit of information was collected in terms of sustained observing systems. So essentially, we have this aspect of observations covered. What we're trying to get to, though, is that we arrive at well-defined requirements for essential Arctic variables that can be linked to shared societal benefits. This is an essential element of what we refer to as the Arctic Observing Roadmap, the way that all of us jointly can navigate and work off of a shared map that tells us where do we want to end up in terms of improved and better coordinated and more useful and impactful observations in the Arctic. So if we follow this roadmap, one of the outcomes of that is that we end up with observing system components and entire observing systems or systems of systems that are co-designed and better integrated through different contributors working off of the same roadmap. Now, it's not sufficient to simply just bundle and glom or glue together independent efforts. We need a coherent set of observations that's jointly developed and that draws on very specific sets of requirements that guide people who want to make observations, that in turn ensure that there are broadly shared societal benefits from these observations. And in that context, again, the theme of food security is a high priority area that's been recognized as being of great importance already prior to the current summit. Some of what we're seeing with the coronavirus outbreaks, the threat that poses to food security to Arctic communities only elevate and heighten the urgency of improved coordination of observations that are relevant for food security. And that's one of the key topics that Working Group 3, that's part of the Arctic Observing Summit, is going to address. So the Arctic Observing Summit then will help lay a foundation for this roadmap. That overarching roadmap effort is part of SEAON, which is a collaborative initiative that involves several dozens of both Arctic and non-Arctic nations. And as mentioned earlier, the Arctic Observing Summit is also going to provide input into the Arctic Science Ministerial process, where we're hoping to see more action, joint, globally coordinated action on some of these pressing issues. Just a brief recap, if you've listened to the keynote presentation by Sandy Starkweather, you might have already seen this, what type of roadmap is envisioned under SEAON. There's a few key principles that might be worthwhile for you to keep in mind as you dive into the working groups. The first one is that the roadmap and the coordination efforts that we're trying to move forward are meant to complement and integrate. They're not supposed to be duplicating anything. They're not supposed to be replacing current planning efforts or approaches that are underway, but rather help us build something out of the individual parts that is much more in the whole than simply a sum of those parts. Also, the road mapping process has to be flexible, it has to be able to adapt and evolve, and it has to be federated in the sense that it brings together different entities and organizational structures and governance bodies. And finally, key here is the recognition that the road mapping process has to include funding and support for involvement of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous experts as equitable partners with active participation throughout the process. So briefly, a quick recap of the essential variables and societal benefits concept using a specific example of sea ice, the oceans, Arctic Ocean's ice cover. A lot of you are familiar with that. Sea ice can be thought of in terms of different variables, such as sea ice concentration, that many of you have seen time series of, but a range of other variables as well. We think of these bundles of very specific variables in their entirety as a set of essential variables, or sea ice itself as an essential Arctic variable, and in part also an essential Arctic process in the context of sea ice growth and development. But in terms of what we're trying to achieve with the summit, the key issue is we want to be able to link clearly identified societal benefits, which have been laid out in great detail through a number of processes at national, international levels. We want to be able to link those societal benefits to specific applications. For example, ocean forecasting, critical in terms of ensuring safety of people at sea, but also very important from a coastal community perspective in terms of threats of inundation or information relevant for subsistence hunters in Arctic indigenous communities. Also, of course, a lot of this information relevant from a perspective of sustainable management or even more specifically, marine hazards response. And so you can see how different applications are tied to specific societal benefits linked to very specific variables, such as, for example, the sea ice developmental stage or the stability of the shore-fast ice that is firmly attached to land. All of these can then be linked to different observing networks, such as satellite-based programs or community-based observing programs, such as the Alaska Arctic Observatory Knowledge Hub here. And these in turn then are linked to or supported by specific data networks. And as you can imagine, these types of activities here on the right, there's plenty of them out there. The goal of the Arctic Observing Summit process and some of the work in the working groups is to better link these individual networks or projects or sustained activities into a broader whole that then allows different types of observations, whether from satellite or at the community level, to mutually benefit, reinforce one another to ensure these types of shared benefits. If you're interested in more background on that, I strongly encourage you to listen to Sandy Starkweather's keynote presentation that provides a bit more of the broader framework under which that roadmap is being compiled. So now let's jump in and just briefly review what can you expect in the way of work in the working groups. This here is the excerpt from the webpage that shows the different working groups with a broad description. If you visit the agenda for a specific day, you will see the view here at right, where you have both the times and a broader description of the working groups broken out. And if you click one of these links here, such as, for example, joining working group 4 Zoom session on this particular day between 2:30 and 5:30 UTC, if you click on that, then essentially that would take you into a Zoom room where a broader group of people who are part of this working group, some of whom have already been working with a small core team to prepare content for the summit, are going to be meeting over the course of these 3 hours to work on specific issues. If you want to learn more about specifically what the agenda for some of these breakout groups looks like, or if you want to learn more about the specific goals of the work in these working groups, you will find on that same working group page, highlighted here in red, a link with a message from the organizers. And these messages from the organizers then take you, if you click that, to an actual agenda and a schedule of working group meetings over the course of the Arctic Observing Summit. So this year is for working group 4, the data systems and federation related working group led by Peter Pulsifer from Canada. And you see in more detail here the actual sessions that that group has scheduled. And for each session then, in a bit more detail, what the group is planning to tackle and work on during those particular sessions. And again, there's additional links here that provide further background. In terms of work in the working groups, you can, again, drawing on the sea ice example, you can expect efforts that are going to be focused on creating and identifying ways in which you can create frameworks within which observations of different essential Arctic variables can be jointly developed, coordinated, managed, and frameworks that allow us to be more specific about the requirements expected from different types of observations for specific sets of applications that then in turn lead to shared societal benefits. So a lot of work in the working groups then will focus in more detail on these types of frameworks, not necessarily on coming up with laundry lists of individual essential Arctic variables, but much more identifying good mechanisms by which the broader community, researchers, Arctic indigenous peoples and Arctic communities, policy decision makers, other operators in the region and outside of the Arctic can best collaborate to ensure that observations are optimized from the perspective of use and impact. And of course, in working group 4 here, the example I just showed, there will be quite a bit of discussion in terms of the data network aspect of this. Just a bit more detail on the question of what to expect in the working group. So one key challenge or one key question is, how do we actually assess or evaluate the impact of observations of specific essential Arctic variables? So identifying frameworks within which you can evaluate the benefits that can be derived from specific observations will be a key topic of discussion in these working groups. And the other aspect here under 2 is to then also identify ways in which we can jointly collaborate over the course of the next year or 2 leading up to the next summit under the umbrella of the SEAN initiative. What type of model allows us to collaborate in fleshing out more details on coordinated observations. And again, Sandy Starkweather's presentation has more detail on that. So what does that look like specifically in the working groups? Well, here is one of 2 tables that you can also access through the website, and I'll show you the link here in a minute, that identify for each theme or each working group. For example, here, theme 3, working group 3, observing and support of indigenous food security and related needs, identifies a specific set of overarching questions that these working groups have been tasked with addressing and providing input on. And you can review this a bit more on your own time, and you will have working group co-leads that will guide you through these different questions, drawing on additional documents and other tools that you can access through the working group pages on the website. Here's the other, the second set of questions or deliverables, if you will. And again, these are all accessible if you visit the web page about the Arctic Observing Summit here at the very right of the set of options. And then you'll find 2 documents, one a very broad introductory document and another one with more detail that includes these questions that are accessible here. Other resources that you may want to consult are also available through this About the AOS website. You've already heard about some of them in other presentations, or might have already explored those yourself. I do want to highlight that from the perspective of the work in the working group, another important resource are the white papers, which you can access through this link here. If you visit the website that has the full white papers and brief statements organized, you'll find them arranged by sub-theme or working group here. So you can review those yourself and see which one might be helpful in terms of some of the activities in the working groups themselves. Finally, just again, sort of a reminder then that once you're in these different working groups, you will be communicating with the folks who are most directly associated. Those are the co-leads and others that form the core team for different working groups. And you'll see also here as an example that several of the working groups are then actually discussing specific white papers. So again, looking at the agenda for different working group meetings may help you identify what would be of interest to read. So just a few final comments then. As mentioned earlier, The goal of the summit is not to come up with a long list of essential Arctic variables. That's work that is done in a different context. Some of it has already been done for some thematic areas. The same is true for identifying relevant societal benefit areas. There is quite a bit in the way of reports and initiatives that have already accomplished that. The goal of the summit rather is to lay the foundation for a framework within which we all can now move forward in jointly developing coordination plans that allow different types of observations to be conducted and obtained in a more interoperable and mutually beneficial manner. And at the same time, of course, in order to identify and develop this foundation, we will work through specific examples. And in terms of examples, we'd like to encourage you, if not urge you, to, if at all possible, focus on examples that relate to the theme of food security and indigenous needs, a theme that's well defined by Working Group 3. And I would also encourage you to listen to the presentation, keynote number 2 by Dr. Daly Sambodoro with the Inuit Circumpolar Council. She has done a great job in laying out the urgency of observations collected and coordinated around the theme of food security, in particular at the present time where the coronavirus is putting additional pressure on some of these drivers and constraints for food security. The final reminder is all of us are learning how to use this online form of interaction effectively. All of us, I'm sure, are in many different ways impacted by coronavirus and other constraints. In particular, we want to recognize that we have a lot of participants from remote Arctic communities where the coronavirus problem is compounded by a number of other challenges communities have to contend with. Please be patient, be kind, realize that all of us who are part of the summit are aiming for the same shared vision. We're looking for Arctic observations that serve the people of the Arctic and all of humanity, in particular in times of pressing information needs. And I would hope that as part of your engagement in the context of Arctic Observing Summit 2020, you continue to stay engaged and work with a larger pan-Arctic global community that is moving this vision forward beyond just the confines of this meeting. Enjoy your time with the Arctic Observing Summit. We're glad you're part of it, and I look forward to seeing some or all of you in various online contexts. Thank you.